when we talk about the muscles in the human body, there are hundreds of them. And obviously, each muscle is there for a reason, and they're all important. But if you would take only one muscle to a desert island, which one would you take? I bet you it would be the diaphragm, so that you can breathe. So let's spend some time looking and zooming in to the main muscle of respiration, which is the diaphragm. The dome-shaped, umbrella-like muscle that recovers your whole cavity here on the rib cage, and that allows, when it contracts, to give space to the lungs to expand. When it relaxes, it just comes all the way back up. So if our friend here would take a breath, you see how the lungs are sitting on the diaphragm. The heart in between the lungs, in the mediastinal space, is completely seated and resting on the diaphragm, and the diaphragm has this dome-shaped structure that has the liver under it. The liver actually is recovered in fascia, which is the peritoneum, but there is a part of the liver that has no fascia, and it's called the bare area of the liver because it's naked and it's in direct contact, tissue to tissue, with the muscular fibers of the diaphragm. So when the lungs inflate, the diaphragm contracts and pushes down, creating space for all the parts of the lung, all the potential space between the parietal pleura and the visceral pleura to expand and to fill up. All the recesses, we have a diaphragmatic recess, will fill up. We also have a mediastinal recess. Those are potential spaces. If you exhale, those spaces make a vacuum. If you inhale and you fill up your lungs, all those spaces can glide into each other and can fill up with lung tissue and give you the possibility to have more air. Now, the diaphragm is the main muscle of respiration, but it has also other muscles that will help when we want to really take a full breath in. Now, if you only use your belly, you can do it only using the diaphragm. But as soon as you start to fill up your lungs and recruit all the intercostal muscles, those muscles will also help. The scalenes and the sternocleidomastoideo will also help to lift up your shoulders so that the top of the lungs, the pleural dome and the top of the lungs can also inflate, because the lungs, just like in this model that we see here, they are suspended by ligaments on the top part, on the dome of the pleura, and we have these suspensory ligaments that are completely linked into the cervical spine. The cervical spine is really important for the diaphragm if we look at the neurology. We say C3, C4, C5, keep the diaphragm alive, because the diaphragm is innervated by the nerve that comes from C3, C4, and C5, which is called the phrenic nerve. The phrenic nerve innervates other structures, but the most important innervation for the phrenic nerve is the diaphragm, and therefore it's really important for us to take a full breath in, and the diaphragm contracts and goes down. Now, more things that we can say about the diaphragm. The diaphragm is, as we said, like an umbrella, and I will show you on a different model, so you have the possibility to imagine it and visualize it even more clearly. Now here we have the rib cage. The phrenic nerve is coming from C3, C4, and C5, keep the diaphragm alive, and it's going to run in between the heart and the lungs, and it's going to come all the way inside and innervate the diaphragm, which I hope you can imagine like a dome-shaped structure that is here. The lungs and the heart are sitting on it, and all the organs, the liver on the right, the stomach and the spleen on the left, are just sitting right under that diaphragm. Now, there are a few structures, many actually, but the most important ones that pierce through that umbrella, that go through the diaphragm. And one is the esophagus. The esophagus is running down and has to pierce through the diaphragm, and then all the contents of the things that we eat will pour into the stomach. So the esophagus is above the diaphragm, and the food will go through the cardia, a sphincter, on the top of the stomach. And when the cardia opens up, bloop, we pass through the esophagus, through the cardia. We are under the diaphragm now, and the food falls into your stomach. There's also the inferior vena cava and the aorta. Inferior vena cava is the main drainage of the main structure when it comes to the drainage of the blood, the return of the blood without oxygen back to the heart. And the aorta is the opposite. It's the main sending artery of oxygenated blood into the whole body. So these two structures, the aorta and the inferior vena cava, they have to pierce, one on the way up, the inferior vena cava, and the other one on the way down, the descending aorta. They all have to pierce through the diaphragm. And a couple more things to say about the diaphragm. The diaphragm is covering all the rib cage here, and it goes in a dome shape like this. If we want to feel your own diaphragm, where is the area that we would have access? Well, you could bring your fingers under the costal margin and try to sneak them in. If you're on the right side, you'll feel some tenderness because there is the gallbladder and the liver in this area. But if you manage to stick your fingers in under your rib cage and you take a full breath in, you're feeling your own diaphragm. You can do that on both sides. Maybe it's even a little bit easier on the left. Another important thing about the diaphragm is that it has all this muscular tissue. There's also a part of the diaphragm that is more tendinous. We call it the central tendon of the diaphragm. And then finally, the attachments of the diaphragm posteriorly onto the vertebral bodies here is really, really important. And it has a couple legs that go down. We call this the crura of the diaphragm. It's like two legs that will attach on the spine and that will stabilize everything. And these two legs, they go as low as L2 on the left side and as low as L3 on the right side. So the diaphragm is up here, yeah, at this level, but the attachment goes all the way down until L2 on the left and until L3 on the right. Actually, a lot of problems that people have in today's world, because their breathing is shallow, because the use of the diaphragm is restricted, because we're not breathing properly, it creates a lot of tension in the upper lumbars and in the thoracolumbar junction. And this tension, this rigidity, this lack of mobility in the upper lumbars and the place where T12 articulates with L1, all this area is tight, which pushes the structures that are neighboring, for example, L4, L3, L4, L5, to be more mobile, and then we have problems in L4, L5, and S1. That's when herniated discs happen in the lumbar area. So problems in the lower lumbars, often related to the crura of the diaphragm. On the upper lumbars, and the rigidity, the lack of movement in the upper lumbars will have a certain effect on the lower lumbars and sometimes even create herniated discs. So this is the long story short for the diaphragm, the muscle of respiration, and not only, it's also for coughing, it's for laughing, for crying, for many, many things. We are using the diaphragm without even knowing.